And I think that teaching is in itself its own version of learning. I think I've learned more when trying to teach something to someone, and from the questions they ask, it just sort of causes you to think about things that maybe you haven't thought about
Yeah, they ask
previously.
really deep questions, usually like, why?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
completely innocent.
Welcome to the Cybrary podcast.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Welcome.
Welcome back.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Ryan Corey, CEO and co-founder of Cybrary, and I'm excited for you to join us on today's episode. Let's jump in.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Cybrary podcast. Today, I am speaking with Caleb Woods, the CEO of Role Model Software. And with me, as usual, is our VP of Engineering, Mike Gruen, my friend. How you doing, Mike?
Doing well.
All right. And Caleb, how are you doing today?
Doing great. It's great to be on with you guys.
Can you tell us a little bit about Role Model Software and what you guys do?
Yeah, so we're a custom software consultancy that really focuses on craftsmanship and collaboration in creating tailored solutions for small and medium-sized businesses, and really have a focus on building up our team alongside of that. So a collaboration mindset that doesn't just stop at the code, but how do we collaborate as business partners, and recognizing that most software isn't built in a vacuum. It has a domain and context of which we're going to build in and problems we're going to solve.
Cool. Can you tell me a little bit about what do you mean by that? Craftsman and how you guys are sort of going about your business?
Yeah. So one of the major things that we looked at, I'm not the original CEO, but our founder, Ken Auer, really started the company with this concept of thinking about mentorship and what that means to really build up a business, kind of looking at sort of the studio mindset that you might see in trades like carpentry or furniture making, where you have a master craftsman that really understands the ins and outs of what solving problems for customers looks like. And we based a number of things on the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. So this idea of like going from an advanced beginner to a novice to becoming proficient and competent and ultimately becoming an expert. You kind of go across these levels of needing recipes to understand how things are done, to having that expert level intuition about how things are done, and recognizing that that's done by having a mindset where you're working alongside each other, which at the time, late 90s, when we were getting started, that was kind of a rare thing when you're talking about software development. It was more of let's throw it over the wall. These are the guys in the basement writing code that are going to put together what we have according to a spec. But really recognizing that that's not the way the good software is made, because it really depends on a feedback loop. And so you need that expertise to jump into that.
Yeah, no, I think, you said sort of late 90s. That's right around when I started in my career, 96. And I definitely lived through or saw that very shift between, programmer versus engineer. And that's how I sort of define the two, right? A programmer is given a specification. Here's what we need you to code and get it done. It still has its place. There's times when that's appropriate. When like really coding to a spec is super important, like life death situations, right? Like, that type of stuff. And then you have, but at the time the web was new, things were moving so quickly, you couldn't have a specification. You really needed it. And, you needed someone who understood the user, could put themselves in the user's perspective and solve the user's problem without that spec. And so now you're talking about more software engineering. It's more craftsmanship, as you said, and how we sort of evolved. And I was in professional services, doing those types of things, e-commerce. And so, I definitely can relate to that difference of, here's, we have a project manager who's making sure the project is moving along, making sure the communications are happening. But in the end, it's really the software engineer getting a problem, understanding the problem, solving the problem, building.
And then leading a team within the midst of that. Like that, right. That's kind of a differentiator for us as we look at what does it mean to be a craftsman? It's the experience. It's the 10,000 hours, if you want to throw out that number. It's the experience in leadership, multiple projects, seeing things in production. Like how many things do you learn from actually getting that call at 2 a.m. or whatever it is from the customer of here's what's gone wrong. And those are the things that kind of feed back into that learning, and then able to lead a team to collaborate as you go through those things.
Right. There's no bigger driver than avoiding the 2 a.m. phone call. Like, how do I make sure that I don't get that call ever again?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a great motivator for sure.
It is.
And so what type of software do you guys specialize at Role Model? I know you kind of build internal tools and stuff for other people. What do you guys actually specialize in, or what do you mainly focus on?
So a lot of the things that we build are web and mobile applications. So we do focus a lot of our solutions on B2B applications, whether that's something internal that a customer is using to simplify a process or scale a process. Maybe they're trying to take some expertise they have from certain technical users and be able to embed that into a system to allow them to grow, or allow oftentimes those people that have the technical expertise to focus on the R&D and the next side of things while they can actually scale the business around the processes that they're building. And we've done a few things, obviously over 23 plus years in businesses where, it's been business, consumer, education, kind of all the gamut of industries, but web and mobile kind of in the B2B space.
When you're bringing people on and you're sort of training them, like, what are you sort of like, where are they starting and how are you going about doing that and getting them the skills they need? Because there's definitely, like, just my own experience real quick, bringing someone out of a college program, for example, comp sci program, great.
Mm-hmm.
They, comp sci, great program, doesn't matter where they went. They're not a software engineer. There's so much that they don't know. And I'm just curious, what your experience with that is and how you sort of go from there.
Yeah. So like a big part of sort of the studio and craftsman mindset is, what does it look like to mentor and bring up the next generation of developers and members of the team? And so that started for us with intentional apprenticeship pretty early on. Let's bring in people. There's a level of skill that you need to have to just follow what's going on. Whether that's a comp sci background or in more recent years, having gone through a boot camp or something to that effect, where you've done some programming, you can follow along with what's going on.
Or even, and I don't want to, there's plenty of people who do a lot on their own, who've learned on their own. They don't necessarily have gone through boot camp. They haven't gone through college program. I don't think that those things are required to be a good software engineer. I think there's plenty of people, especially over the last few years, the space has gotten to the point where you can really do a lot of self-taught, self-learning, just do pet projects, and you sort of have a base skill level that you can, so that you can follow along, as you said, even if you don't necessarily have all the skills of a software engineer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's my story.
Right.
I got into software development kind of from being involved in a company where I was kind of in IT, kind of on the QA side of an outsourced project. Really discovered I had an aptitude to be able to jump in and actually start doing some of the programming, and then eventually kind of took over and built a mentorship program there. And that's actually kind of, that was the connection that led me to Role Model. That company ended up having a financial hardship that I ended up leaving and looking for another opportunity, which is how I got connected with Role Model. And that was about 8 years ago. And as around the time that we were really kind of formalizing what bringing on these more junior developers and what's a pipeline of making that happen. And so we formalized this concept that we call the Craftsmanship Academy. And it's had some different variations of what that's looked like. But it really is trying to take somebody from that base level background, doing an immersion style training of, all right, we're going to build real things, solve some real problems, but in a progressive way. We're going to really start with, test driven development as a foundation of everything we do. It's so important. Thinking from an object oriented perspective, how do we think about encapsulation? How we break down a system, how you use the tools of the trade. How do you use your editor? How do you use the terminal? How do you use Git? What do pull requests and code reviews look like? Kind of incorporating those into, all right, here's a foundation. We're going to progressively build on that, looking at the same problem, but attacking it different ways and progressively adding in more technology. Because the thing about the web, because it's evolved so much at this point, there's much that a lot of us that have been grown up with it or grown up around it from a career standpoint look at, and it's like, oh yeah, this is all standard stuff that you expect. Right. You dump somebody new in there and it's like, wait, you mean to put text on a page, I've got like 8 different technologies I got to understand in order to get going. And so how do you progressively make that simpler of, okay, you need to understand the basics of we're sending data over a socket. And okay, but that's what that looks like. But we don't really do it this way most of the time because we have these abstractions that are in place. But if you don't understand the low level piece of what's going on, you don't feel the benefit, the abstraction or the frameworks are giving you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think it's one of those things, we recently, as I said, we recently hired some, people straight out of college. And I think it had been so long since we'd onboarded that level of junior engineer that we were like, oh, you don't know how to use this, this or that, whatever it was, or this is what a good pull request looks like. And this is why, and as somebody who's doing a pull request review, this is our expectation of you. When you're reviewing it, it's not just look it over and be like, oh yeah, that looks like it works. Like, no, pull it down, test it, like comment on things. That's how you're going to learn. Like, why did you do this? It's a two-way thing. So I think it's one of those barriers from our perspective, from my perspective, running an engineering team. It's one of the things that prevents me from wanting to hire more junior people is the amount of time it takes to sort of ramp them up, the time it takes away from my more senior folks. And if I'm not exercising that muscle frequently enough, it's just that much harder. And I'm curious, and it's probably, there's maybe if I was in a professional services or space where in a lot of ways my product is my engineers and my engineering talent, we'd be more motivated to take those risks and take on that sort of pipeline. I'm just curious, like, is that what sort of motivates you is the fact that that if you can get these people and train them in your way of doing things, that you're really creating more business capacity for yourselves?
Yeah, it's the long-term play. I mean, we look at getting someone to that level of craftsman. If they're coming into the academy, and we've seen this play out now that we've kind of been running cohorts about every year through that program, that it's 5 to 10 years from the point that they walk in the door to they're at that level. And that sounds like a long time. That is not the quick way to build the senior talent on the team. But the foundation that they have is aligned with the way we work. It's aligned with the values that we have of software development, and they're growing in the way to collaborate. So they're contributing all along that way. It's not like, okay, here you jump in and we're not really getting value out of the contribution that person can make until 3 or 4 years in.
I'm curious, when do you feel like you're getting that sort of contribution from people? I have a number in my head of where I think that would be, and I think people would be surprised. But I'm curious where you're sort of seeing it.
So we kind of look at it as there's the initial immersion of 2 months, and then we put them back into kind of an internship apprenticeship. Okay, you've been doing things inside of this bubble. Let's go sit alongside our team that's working on projects, get some experience that way, and then come back to kind of a second level of immersion where we incorporate some other technologies. So at that point, we're about 4 months into the process. And that's where we officially give them their apprentice stripe, if you will. And they're ready to start to contribute on projects. We consider it's like half the time they'll be contributing to some level. In a lot of projects we look at, you establish the pattern of how you're going to do something, and then, all right, there is something that somebody more junior can take the next step of. But we're focusing on continuing mentorship. So each apprentice has a mentor that they're working with, and we're evaluating their progress through that each 3-month kind of period of a mini kind of performance review, or we call it craftsmanship levels that we're reviewing with them of where are the things that they need to grow in, from whether it's the technical skills, problem solving, breaking down cards, all those kind of pieces that go into software delivery.
Yeah, and I think 90 days sounds about right. I mean, I think, sorry to sort of jump in there, but that's 90 days, 120 days seems like about where I'd expect to start getting sort of a return on the investment. They're still learning. I'm still investing in them, obviously, but that's when you can start really putting them things. So it's interesting. I just find it interesting. It sort of aligns with my own thoughts on just going back in my own career and pulling from previous experience. So it's cool to see that that's still the case.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Also, one of the things we look at, we call it a cohort when we bring people through the academy, and we found that that's a really powerful aspect of it. That if you are just bringing one person through that, they're learning everything they're learning by themselves. Like they don't have
Mhm.
another peer that's going through that. And it is less effort for us to bring two people through that, or potentially three or four, than it is to do one, because they've got that group learning. It's, oh, I figured this out. I can help explain it to you. And that's the hard part. The further away you get from those levels, it's harder to relate to the learning that happens at the next step. And that's really why we try to look at the mix of our team. Um, do we have somebody, you can't be just above them, but maybe just like one or two levels above them of where they're at, so that you can relate to, I remember when I was learning that, 6 months ago or 2 years ago, versus I remember when I was learning that 15 years ago.
Exactly. Right. I
Very
mean,
different.
and right. And not only that, I mean, technology changes so much. There's so much that happens. And I totally agree that the notion of bringing two people in or three people on is what is the same effort as bringing in one person. And I remember my very first job, we were all new. Like there was our manager, he had been coding for a short period of time. And they just hired me, another guy, and we'd never worked as software engineers. This, like, one of us had written some programs in the past, but I was still in college. The other guy was still in college. And yeah, we were sort of thrown into it. And it's amazing how much we learned and figured out from each other and whatnot. And I agree. I think whenever I try and bring in, if I'm going to take on that, like, okay, we're going to bring in some junior people, I think it is great to do a team. Or like if I'm doing summer internships, I never want a summer internship of a singleton. You're not going to get any value out of it. You need to work as part of a team, even if that's just a 2-person pair on a real project, doing real work. That's how you get experience. And yeah, tag them up with somebody who's maybe like a year, maybe 2 years ahead of them, who, as you said, has that, like, still has that empathy. I think it's empathy for what that person's going through.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the Craftsman, I mean, Jake or Caleb, when you and me were speaking before, the Craftsmanship Academy is what really piqued my interest in kind of wanting to speak with you. Cause I mean, I myself was hired into a position at the place me and Mike used to work. I was just kind of our IT person to start with. That's the skill set that I had. Had zero dev background or anything. I eventually got moved onto our DevOps team as the most junior DevOps engineer there has probably ever existed. I didn't know how to use Git. I didn't know how to do anything, but I had people who were training me, helping me out and explaining how things worked. And then, I mean, that's how I got used to it. And I became pretty good at that role, but it was all on the job training. And, that stuff that it's hard to kind of teach yourself those things if you don't have, real world scenarios and stuff like that, learning how to do a pull request, learning, what comments you should leave, all of that stuff. So, I mean, when you're bringing people through the Craftsmanship Academy, like what kind of mentoring or training are you guys going through? Like, what does that, start to finish program look like for you guys?
Yeah. So like I said at the beginning, it's more of an immersion. So it's like, here's the problem set that we're gonna look at. And we're gonna start with kind of the simplest way we can think about the technology, like writing a CLI with driving it with tests, no communication over the network, introducing the network, introducing HTML and CSS, introducing some of the frameworks we commonly use. But then a big part of it is all the learning that happens after the immersion, because that's where all the contextual learning comes from. Of, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to solve this problem and I'm stuck. Now I'm really, after I've banged my head against the wall and it doesn't have to be very long. Like that's one of the things I try to tell people early on is don't get stuck for hours. We want to have people working co-located when they're at this junior level, because that's when the senior person needs to be able to look over and say, I haven't checked in with you at all in an hour. And you really look like you're stuck, like the expression on your face and all that.
Or the junior person has that ability to look around the room and be like, okay, that person has their headphones on. Maybe I shouldn't bother them. But the person sitting next to them is just shooting the shit with their buddy. I can go talk to them. And I think there's that co-location is very important, to be able to just have that visual, like, I'm not interrupting you. Can you help me with this thing? As opposed to, I think when you're totally remote, it's so easy to just sit there and struggle and not think there's anyone there who can help you get to that next step quickly.
At any time there's that barrier. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a big barrier to make you think, sending a Slack message or reaching out in some way, it seems like sort of low barrier. But when you're at that level, like I'm trying to prove that I can do this on my own too, right?
Right.
Is the other side of it. So, and that's where the explanations kind of come in, and that's the level of teaching that see is such a valuable part of what the rest of our team does. Because now you're not only having to understand what you're learning, but you have to teach somebody else. And there's that teaching that's going on all the time because we have people of those various levels solving similar problems together.
And I think that teaching is in itself its own version of learning. I think I've learned more when trying to teach something to someone, and from the questions they ask, it just sort of causes you to think about things that maybe you haven't thought about.
Yeah, they ask really deep questions, usually like, why?
Right.
Like, completely innocent as why is it that way? No,
yeah.
Because that's the way we all do
it. Or you see the shortcuts that you usually take because you've been doing it for a while, but you're like, you should do it this way instead. So you're not duplicating my mistakes or something like that.
And that's the hard part. I look at a lot of things from an experiment. Try small things, learn from those. But you've got to have some of that feedback cycle of what things worked and didn't. And, like we talked about kind of production support, having things go wrong and, the iterations of you going through projects is how you get a lot of that learning. You have to have some of that pain fail to some extent to see that. So you don't want to completely isolate that, but want to do it with a safety net of, okay, yeah, when that doesn't work, you've got somebody that's next to you
that can bail you out or help you out. Yeah, no, I think failing is, you learn more from your failures than from your successes. And I think, the best piece of code I ever wrote was whatever the last piece of code I ever wrote was. And then it hits production, right? Whatever. And you learn so much. And I'm curious, so you were talking a little bit about this sort of the process. And do you guys have any sort of notion of like tracks or anything like that? Because I think there's a very different skill set for, say, a back-end engineer than, say, maybe a front-end engineer or designer or those types of things. Do you guys, how do you handle that?
Yeah, so we do that a little bit, and we're a fairly full stack shop. We do have some more depth to a particular JavaScript framework that we build on for things in the 3D visualization and construction spaces. So we kind of have a track of here's where the teams are and the kinds of projects you're going to be working on. But often from a skill set standpoint, it's a lot of the similar kind of things that we want to do because the goal is to end up with, overlapping skill sets, whatever track that you're on. If it's more back-end focused as a developer or maybe more DevOps focused, there's still an overlap with development. Or if it's more design focused, what's the overlap with front-end development? And that does evolve a bit based on the individual, what are their skill set? And we usually try to pair that up with who their mentor is. So I feel like it's really important to have a rotation of mentors as we're going through that process. So you get a chance to see where others are strong or have still areas of growth that you might be able to help them in, because it's kind of a two-way street in a lot of ways. But that's often how we help to steer where people are going.
How do you that mentoring pairing? I think is so important. I don't if you don't mind me pulling on that a little bit, because I think like how did I I've been mentored and I mentor throughout my career, and it's all been very organic. It's people who I saw who were maybe ahead of me or in some role or whatever, and who also had the capacity, and by that I mean like the actual capability to mentor, right? Not everybody's well suited for it. But it was me self-selecting the people that I want to model myself after and me being selected by others. And I'm curious, in your organization, it sounds like you take, you're definitely pairing people up, but then at some point do the individuals get to sort of choose who their mentor is, or will it happen naturally? Or is it a constant rotation and you're finding great things from that? I'm just curious how that all works.
Yeah, there's a bit of a matching up, like who is a good fit for where this person is at. So often we're trying to look at what's the next 1 to 3 things that this person is focusing on to get to the next level. Who could we be pairing them up with to work on that? And we do make that a pretty intentional thing. They're meeting regularly to take a step back from the projects they're working on. We also try to line things up that they're working on similar projects together. Like a lot of pairing and growth, some of that can happen in that 1 hour one-on-one happening once a week, but a lot of that happens in the other 39 hours of working on whatever projects you're working on, and getting a chance to ask those questions.
Yeah, I would say almost all of mine has been more in those like where we're actually pairing on solving some problem, whatever it was, building something that didn't exist, and just even sitting there watching and being the second pair of eyes. It's like, oh, I think you missed a thing there. Back when your IDE didn't tell you, you made a syntax error, right? And again, that gets back to like, why don't you have somebody who's got like 20 years of experience onboarding somebody? Because I'd start you off with VI, right? That's nobody needs that. Unless you're in DevOps, and then it's an important skill to have.
Yeah, that was the first book somebody gave me, was a VI book. And I was like, I don't understand this. I don't know what you want me to do with this book.
Yeah,
Hold
VI
the door
is one of
open.
those things I still love to try to expose people to, because there is so much to it. Like, it's a different mental model way of thinking. And so much of kind of what we do with software development is developing new mental models to think about problems.
Right.
And so I agree for the most part. Don't throw somebody VI when they're trying to figure out, how do I put code into the editor?
How do I use terminal?
How do I save?
Are you remembering me shouting from my desk, Mike? This is where this is coming from?
No, it's just that's the most common thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, I really like that, that role model is kind of taking the time to, like you said, kind of create the next generation of software developers. Because now, I mean, Caleb, you and me talked before, and Mike, you just had a podcast recently about this, is everyone's on the lookout for that unicorn, or that person who's going to fit that one specific role that they have, instead of, bringing up the next people and training them to fit this role. You're looking for somebody who already has X, Y, and Z, where you might have somebody who just doesn't have the experience yet, but is capable of doing that job.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of that, comes organically. What's the opportunities that come up? Every person on the team, because we were such a focus on learning, they're going to gravitate to new things that come out, from the technology landscape or from different projects. And so by having a shared foundation as a team, it allows us to even be more flexible in the way we pivot and go after some of those things, because, okay, you have the understanding of what we're trying to accomplish when we're selecting new tools or new frameworks or whatever it is we're looking at. You can now take that when we're evaluating this new technology and bring, your own curiosity and expertise that is going to grow from that, but also be able to integrate it back to the team, because we don't have a high turnover as kind of part of that, especially as we've gotten to more senior folks. Our average tenure of our craftsmen is 9+ years. That doesn't mean, the gap in the middle from the most junior folks to getting to that point doesn't have some turnover there, but it kind of builds that long-term longevity, because we're a team that understands how we work together, and can feed off that.
Is there sort of like a plateau, like a breaking point? Like, if you can make it this far, then you're probably going to make it the rest of the way. Because I just sort of think of all of the software engineers I've worked with over the years who maybe had some interest in programming, they sort of get into it or whatever it is, but then they just find that like the idea of fighting a computer and losing every day is just a little daunting and not really the career for them. I'm curious, like, at what point are you seeing that people sort of make that recognition of like, maybe this isn't really for me? And that's great. Like, you tried it. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't, it's, I'm looking at Tommy.
Hey. That's why I run the podcast now.
And he does a great job.
Yeah, it's way easier. I'll tell you that. It is way easier.
So yeah, I'm just sort of curious. Do you see like, is there like a natural point where like people make it this far, they're just going to keep on going, or is it the full range?
I'd say that it really kind of does vary, but the first 2 weeks of the immersion phase is usually the most telling, actually. So we try to do a good job of kind of an interactive assessment, because so much of what the skill set is how you think. So we try to do that in how we assess people coming into the program. But then when they get into it, and then we do some prep work, we do some other things to filter folks out. But that first 2 weeks is probably one of the biggest cases of,
which is a great setup for modern software engineering. Fail fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that is a good lesson. Like that's a great first lesson, I think, is fail fast, right? Like how do you figure out whether or not this is the right thing for you? Well, we better not spend a lot of time figuring that out.
Yeah, right. And then from there, I mean, there is some more. So we go through a few different apprentice and residency stages before we give someone their Dev 1 sort of level. And once they get to that level, it's usually the progression from there is pretty smooth. But there's different people that realize, I do want to do more of just staying at this focus, or I'm not as interested in mentorship or some of these other things. And that's where it becomes, okay, maybe the culture fit isn't there in the same way. You might still have a software bent, or there's been other folks that have kind of come through that level and recognized being involved with software projects is a good fit, but they're not a developer. Like they've got skill set that comes in as more of a PM or on some of the business side or sales engineering, some of those different things that are still valuable aspects of the team. And we now share a foundation.
So if, before we get too far from it, you mentioned earlier, you take on it's sort of an annual program for the cohort. When do you guys usually are doing that? Like when does that happen?
Yeah, so we do that each summer. So we're actually kind of in the throes of that right now of assessing applicants for this summer's cohort. So we're taking interesting applicants can go to craftsmanshipacademy.com. We got a lot of information there of kind of like how we run the program, philosophy behind it, and then inviting people to apply and check it out. And so then that kicks off the process with some pre-work in the May timeframe, and then we get started with the immersion phase in June.
Cool. Now, is that a remote available, or is it on site, I'm guessing?
Yeah, so on site. Yeah, so the first 8 weeks of immersion, kind of to a lot of the things that we talk about, on site, and then from there, on site in one of our offices. So whether it's where we are here in North Carolina as kind of our headquarters, or one of the other places where we have a couple of people, sort of Rochester, Knoxville, Wisconsin. There's a couple different other areas that we have folks.
Okay.
I feel like I can't not ask like how the pandemic has sort of affected that and having people come in, like, because I know like we struggle with it a little bit. We were fortunate that we moved from a smaller office to we're now in a much larger space. So being at 50% or 25% capacity is not a problem, and we can still have everybody in the company here and still not be worried. But I'm curious like how COVID has sort of impacted you guys and what steps you guys are taking.
Yeah, for us, we've been a fairly remote first type organization. About 5 or 6 years ago, we started kind of establishing these Craftsman centered locations, which is we had people we really wanted to work with. We value the in-person collaboration, but we recognized we couldn't have everybody be in the Raleigh area of North Carolina and continue. There's different life things happening to say, hey, we want to keep these relationships with these people. They're valuable members of the team. But we don't want to just give up in-person collaboration either. So what we've tried to do over the years is build around places where we have craftsmen. So it's not just you're just one person, but there's a couple, 2, 4, kind of up to that level that are working in, shared co-working space, or if somebody has a setup for that within part of their property or something like that to do that. And so that's kind of how we've grown some of the remote team. But we've also operated from the fact that, sometimes we're working on site with clients, or, just various things are going on. So we operate very much in the fact that we're not in the same building. We just really value the opportunity where we can. So in March, when everyone was on stay-at-home orders, we became the first time we were fully virtual. We did our what we normally do for in-person collaboration, professional development days. We did those fully remote in April. And then as things have opened back up kind of across the country, we've still had a mix, not trying to force anybody to have to come in the office if they're not comfortable with that, because we still have a lot of our collaboration that can happen remotely. And then in our space that we do have, just setting that up that people can be working together point makes the most sense.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's a smaller group, it's not the full company. It's not like 60 people showing up. It's
Right.
4 or 5 people who are the same 4 or 5, and is very, very different. It's and especially from a footprint, from a surface
You kind of create
area.
your own little bubbles, right?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
these are the
Right.
people that you interact with every day.
Right.
So, take the same precautions that anybody would as
Right.
far as exposures and things like that. But you're working with the same people on a regular basis. So
I think the only thing, you mentioned you're taking applications now. Are there any deadlines people should be aware of?
yeah, usually we try to kind of get final applications in so that we can start doing notifications of acceptance by the end of February. So getting the applications in at that point so we can kind of do the evaluation process. So yeah, if folks are interested, that would be the time frame. Jump on it now. We're probably just a couple weeks away from that at this point, but that's the biggest thing there.
Okay.
Cool.
So they can find out more information at craftsmanshipacademy.com.
Yes.
So we said, all right. And yeah, so applications now through the end of February. So make sure to get on that if you're interested in joining the Craftsmanship Academy. Thanks, Caleb, for stopping by. Yeah, Mike, as always, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, everybody.